Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. Now, this is a show called Insight, where we discuss books on politics, some of them contemporary, some are historical perspective to provide some insight onto the present. Some of them address broader trend or atmospheric ways of looking at political developments. Today's book is addressing essentially media issues, but also how to teach yourself. It's written by a man named Bruce Bartlett. He has been a Republican consultant in various presidential administrations, and the title of his book is called The Truth Matters, A Citizen's Guide to Separating Facts from Lies and Stopping Fake News in Its Tracks. Now, joining me on the show today are two Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is James Hechler. And to James's right is Sarah Hughes. So what I wanted to do was to read a brief quotation from the book to give you a sense of where the book is coming from, and then we'll jump into a discussion about this particular book. So the author writes, "It's possible that as time goes by, the problem of fake news will take care of itself. It's become such an acute problem only because social networks are still relatively new, and those who learned how to promote fake news in service of an agenda have a head start. Eventually, people may learn to be more discriminating on their own, or the various technological fixes will be successful. In the end, the best defenses against fake news are critical thinking, taking in news from a variety of sources, including those that don't confirm your own biases, and being skeptical about information that sounds too good to be true."
I would most certainly agree with that statement, but really only to a certain extent. The media has most certainly grown exponentially with this stigma of apparent news stories. I wouldn't necessarily call it a bias. Bias is, as we've often discussed together, it's really a bad term to put together. But rather, these news networks are really just pandering to different demographics, sort of an agenda. I would more or less call it a news outlet for everybody, where people can find news outlets that they want to hear. Let's be honest, we all really like things we want to hear. So if we find something online or on the cable news networks that we really don't like, we tend to gravitate away from those sources, and rather we tend to go toward the sources that we do like.
No, yeah, just going off of that, I very so much agree with you. I'd like to point out in the first sentence we mentioned, the author mentioned, as time goes by. And I find this interesting because his whole story is pretty much breaking down the evolution of the term fake news, and establishing of how it starts can establish how to end it. So he also mentions tools, which I completely agree would be the best defense against fake news as well. So.
Yeah, I think I should point out that the use of the term fake news has nothing to do with Donald Trump, despite the fact that he likes to use it, because basically he is somebody who grew up with tabloid journalism, and he liked the idea that tabloid journalism always wrote about him and talked about him, and they were never ones to sort of critically take a look at him, because that was the sort of glitzy stuff that you would do in late night New York high society. So I think he's got a thin skin for anybody who's looking at him. So he uses the term fake news that is sort of, well, you better only write about me in a good way, and that's it. And so this is different. You're trying to sort of understand, he's sort of trying to give you a self-help guide to sort of go out there and try and get a sense of how do I learn on my own. You've got this wonderful internet in front of you with lots of stuff on it, and a lot of people don't necessarily know how to use it well.
Absolutely. the author goes on to mention on page 2, he talks about all the various different sources of news that we have here in the 21st century. We have, like BuzzFeed, YouTube shows such as the Young Turks, if I were to name a very prominent news show on YouTube. And there's also a lot of other shows that are on both sides, and I think arguably the most prominent of these, and these tend to get the most hype, are these conspiracy shows such as InfoWars by Alex Jones. He really tends to gravitate and latch on to these conspiracy theories. It's more or less, I would describe what we would call a shock therapy, where he's using these scare tactics to draw more of his audience towards what he really wants to hear.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I do think that people choose what type of media they want to watch based off of their beliefs, and that's how you kind of fall into, well, is there media bias, or is there nonpartisan or partisan, or is media establishing with Republican, right, left, Democrat, and then you just get into the whole terms and everything. So I would agree with that statement.
As he says that term, it's possible as time goes by, referring to InfoWars with Alex Jones, that essentially he's been chased off of almost every source, and he's now going through lawsuits because of the Newtown shootings going back some years ago when children were killed at a school in Connecticut. And so parents have taken him to court because of his silly conspiracies, or absolutely nutty ones, which unfortunately people believe. Particularly that these children were not killed, but that they were child actors, and this was some design by apparently the then Obama administration to take their guns away, and that people would believe such nonsense. But unfortunately, many of them still do. One of the parents was talking about it the other day in a newspaper article, that they were confronted by people that still believe this. So I'm wondering whether that trial might have eventually some impact on some of the ways that people develop a sense of responsibility of what they find online.
Leading off of that, I personally wanted to bring up an issue brought up in the book, the McClellan story. It is in reference to President Fillmore. He was a writer, journalist. He made up, based off of his imagination, a story involving the White House and the first bathtub ever installed by President Fillmore. Well, this was a completely made-up story, but still to this day, he finds that many writers write about this and think that it's true. Yeah. And I think that shows perfectly how making things up, people can believe them, because if they're from reliable sources, then they would have no doubt to not believe in them.
Absolutely. I think with that, we definitely see the advent of these satirical news outlets where, obviously, at this point now, if you go on certain websites such as The Onion or the Babylon Bee, which I think the Babylon Bee would be my personal favorite for funny satirical news stories, you definitely know at this point going in that all of these stories are most certainly fake and made up for sure. So I'm definitely with you on those satirical stories.
Yeah, and leading off of that, 24-hour media. How much of that can be a lie? How much news can you physically talk about? That's when you get into the point of debating public or political opinions. So, that's just your opinion. That's not valid resources, scholarly sources backing up your valid arguments.
Absolutely.
So,
he had a quote. He quoted Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wrote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. The real extent of this state of misinformation is known only to those who are in situations to confront facts within their knowledge with the lies of the day." And so he was trying to sort of just point out that this sort of problem has been around for an incredibly long period of time. It gets more magnified in the current setting with sort of social media technology that you have today as opposed to what was there in the past.
Yeah, it was definitely a little bit different in that day. A lot of times, major political figures, especially in early American history, would own their own newspaper companies. So besides just printing general news, they tended to gravitate a lot towards more of these big opinion sessions. Thomas Jefferson himself, and some of the other founding fathers, such as James Madison especially, were involved with a group known as the Federalist Papers, where they would post their own views about the formation of the Constitution, what they agreed and disagreed with it at that time.
It was interesting. At the beginning of the book, he talks about the end of the Fairness Doctrine, and this was sort of comes to an end in 1987. And so with the Fairness Doctrine, you sort of had to present things more within a smaller range of variation. So once you end it, you start to have greater pushes towards either end. And he's sort of addressing the idea that people that think of themselves as conservative were the ones that really were able to take advantage of things like radio and have more conservative points of view on radio, and that you went farther to the right of right, which then led to what he's feeling. Now, this is a Republican writing this book, a very prestigious, well-known Republican advisor to presidents. And so he's feeling that people that think of themselves as conservatives are more prone to believe conspiracy theorists. And so as a result, they're more susceptible to some of the things that you're going to be getting in very, very extremely right-wing sites or listening on the radio.
I'm going to attempt to give more of a little bit of a background on the Fairness Doctrine for those who may not be well aware with the Fairness Doctrine. Back in the day, especially if you looked on more of the mainstream news networks such as NBC, CBS, and ABC, those were the big three at the time. Instead of basically making money off of these news shows that were really just panels of discussions, they were really just there more or less as reporters. You especially look at the old reporters such as Walter Cronkite and Tom Brokaw. That's really what they did. They were merely reporters at that time, and that's where the Fairness Doctrine more or less kicked in. Well, when it was abolished in 1987, we really start to see that advent of these more highly opinionated news outlets such as CNN and, of course, conservative radio. Perhaps the most prominent figure, two figures, I would say, for conservative talk show radio anymore would be Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin. I do tend to listen to both shows just to hear more or less a different source and become more knowledgeable of the political landscape around me. And I really do that just to more or less get these different opinions and draw upon all these different opinions and different sources that I have to come up with a more well-rounded and more educated opinion of my own.
I think it's important to address, especially in Rush Limbaugh's case, from the book, that opinions, when debating political opinions, it's usually just a distraction. It's just something to take up time. And once they found out they could do that and make money off of it, it was just the next big thing. So, I mean, it's very deceiving, and that's honestly very sad.
Absolutely. That's why I don't tend to just focus on those shows alone, but rather I will go to a multitude of other political shows as well, just to see, A, what the quote-unquote opposition has to say, and B, what do the academic sources say as well, and what can I draw out of these different shows.
Regarding somebody like, let's say, Rush Limbaugh, there's this, I'm paraphrasing, but it's a quote from Henry Kissinger, and Kissinger was Secretary of State in the 1970s and then had won the Nobel Peace Prize, but he said, "I don't watch TV news to learn anything. I watch TV news to see what the man in the street believes is real." And he was saying this before you had 24-hour-a-day cable news shows, so that as a result you look at the notion of, so you're trying to sort of have a sense of, I'm reading a lot of this stuff and none of it is on television news, and television news, it doesn't matter whether it's CNN or MSNBC or Fox. You're thinking, wait a minute, I'm sitting here and reading a great deal of things over here that don't seem to have a relationship to whatever is being covered here. And I think to some extent this book is trying to give you some insight. As I said, he was a political figure, high-ranking within a White House, Republican White Houses. He had a quote here that was very good. He said, "Politicians frequently assert greater knowledge than they actually have. I know I have often given interviews based not on personal experience or inside knowledge, but on what I had read in the paper that day. In a sense, it was a case of the blind leading the blind." And so that notion, and it's difficult for people, I think, to grasp this. I read that and I thought, I know it's true from me having interviewed an incredible number of politicians and people that are within the military, government officials that are not elected over the years. And yes, they don't know everything. There are huge gaps in what they know and don't know. And so this, to me, made complete sense, but you don't get a sense of that when you're watching TV. It's like, I know everything, and I'm going to now pontificate because I know it all, and I know that's nonsense. But so it's a good quote.
Absolutely. One thing I would definitely want to add going along with that is politicians most certainly do tend to bluff what they know. But with that, though, the journalists and other publishers need to, in a way, really be careful with either A, going along with what that politician is saying and hold it to be true, and along with that, also be careful of not going too far when calling them out on their bluff. That's really where the so-called leaks come in, where a leak can really be anything from just an important announcement that's going to be publicized by a politician and the journalist basically just jumps the gun. That's really the best case scenario for that. A worst case scenario, though, would be more of a private matter that maybe that politician has, be it in his private life or what have you, and that can most certainly cause a bit of a riot.
Yeah, with addressing this, I think it's important to realize through Bruce Bartlett's experience in the White House and being a politician, he most likely has developed certain tools for when, like, he can understand when something's said, like, oh no, this would be incorrect, like, my job would never permit me to say this, or, oh no, this is correct, like, this is perfectly relevant. And going off of that and the leaks, I think it's important to address that most leaks are usually unintentional and usually harmless. Reporters often believe leaks more than they do quotes, and also they and that's why they end up trying to, if somebody gives them a leak, they want to back it up with an additional source. So you don't want to just rely on one person to say something. You're going to try and back it up, and you'll find that. He tried to address, to some extent, that problem because he calls it the problem of documentation, which is an expression he uses, and he feels what you want a believer to do is what's the documentation that you're relying on, which is why he likes hyperlinks or links when you're reading something online, that it takes you to, let's say, another source or an original source, and that you can track where something came from. And so he, to some extent through the book, is trying to address some of that. Politicians also sometimes leak sources and information to reporters because they want it to get out, things that might be, in fact, not true, to start up something.
Well, yeah, trial balloon is what you're doing. You'll see that, for example, when there's an opening on the Supreme Court, and then you suddenly see names floated in the press, and you're trying to just, that's usually coming out sometimes from White House sources where they're trying to get names out there to see what sort of reaction there will be to, hey, the White House is considering this person or this person, and then to see the reactions. That's why he's got a chapter here called Confusing Press Conventions, and then says you have to understand the terms on the record, off the record, on background, so that you realize how they're used in writing stories for newspapers.
If I were to summarize those three terms, on the record, off the record, and of course deep background, on the record is a jargon term that journalists use that basically give authorization for that particular source or statement to be made completely public. It's totally okay for the person's name who said that to be completely disclosed. As far as off the record goes, there's a little bit more of a veil, so it can be a statement that can be made, but at the same time, the person that said that, be it a politician or a journalist, has a little bit of a shield behind that. So.
When it comes to on and off the record, to me, I like to think of, was the person at an event or meeting that saw this take place, because that would make them a primary source. Whereas like a secondary source would be hearsay, someone that heard something that happened at an event and meeting. And like background, for example, would be information that a writer or journalist wouldn't necessarily state, but would use to develop their own opinion when writing. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing, because there's so many tell-all books coming out about the Trump administration. You're trying to figure out exactly, were you in the room, or did you get that from somebody who was in the room, and exactly what was said, or did you hear it from somebody else who might have been a third party who heard it from somebody who was in the room. And so as a result, you're trying to get a feeling, where is the person that's writing this book, are they sort of the fly on the wall, where they're sort of closer to what was actually being said. And so I think with so many of these tell-all books coming out, maybe collectively you start then being able to feel like, okay, I have a feel, because I'm trying to see where they have some points in common.
That's one thing that the author really wants to prove a point in this book concerning the primary sources versus the secondary sources. In crime scene investigations, normally the investigators tend to not view or look at the primary sources, basically the people affected or those that affected the others, so much as they look at more or less the forensic evidence, which is more of a secondary source in a way. If I were to give a really good example as to why primary sources may not be the best idea when addressing a certain event, would be, look at the 9/11 terrorist attacks. You have a lot of different primary sources and different personal views as to what happened that day in New York. People were at different places at different times in the New York metropolitan area, so they would have seen certain from different angles the attacks as they were going out, which can lead to the rise of, again, more or less conspiracy theories. There's one conspiracy theory out there that the planes that hit the Twin Towers were basically from a government, and they were authorized to go in and hit these towers, where it may look that way from a certain angle depending on how you look at the plane if you stop the camera, but the fact of the matter is it really isn't the case.
Yeah, I think to take away from that, terms are continuously, all the time, abused by journalists, reporters. So if you're not comfortable or familiar with the term, just don't be afraid to ask. And I think that's the main point that the author's trying to take away from this, is know where you stand and know how to make your own decisions.
Absolutely.
He had a good chapter I liked called Trusting Academic Sources. So he was distinguishing between how you're getting information from certain universities or universities in general versus think tanks, and that this term think tank sort of implies that it's impartial and it's detached and you're going to be doing the same thing as a university. And he's trying to point out, well, a lot of think tanks aren't really think tanks in that sense that they're detached knowledge. They're sort of actually proponents for certain points of view. And so you have to maybe sort of be able to realize, wait a minute, this is an organization that has a certain point of view it's trying to push, even though they may have sounding that sounds like a high academic title. And so he's sort of just trying to make people aware. You have to have a sense of awareness of this as you start to maybe hear these people easily speak on TV shows.
Absolutely. Drawing upon Bartlett's personal experience with think tanks and these quote-unquote experts, one of the problems he had with the think tanks and these other panels that he would be on, he would be more or less on the Republican side or conservative side of a panel, and then he would have 2 or 3 other people that would supposedly have an opposing view. Problem he had with those, not only did they just tend to not work very well, they really didn't get anywhere with an argument. Both sides ended up really agreeing on an article as opposed to trying to prove that one side is right and the other isn't. As far as the experts go, these quote-unquote experts can really be anybody. If I had to pinpoint one particular example where sometimes these experts can be rather ludicrous, is when Bartlett was on TV and he was talking with a homeless man about minimum wage. You know, how do you really argue or logically have a discussion with a homeless person on the minimum wage? Because a homeless person is obviously going to have really strong and high opinions on the minimum wage that the panelists and expert may not have.
We only have a few minutes left. What did you think of this book, and are you recommending people listening to us read it?
I would most certainly recommend this book to other people. It's really similar to a book I read about a year ago. I wish I could remember the name of the book, but it really drew upon more or less the evolution of the news media as we see it today. This book, I would more or less consider it more or less a sequel of that book. The previous book more or less shows where we have come from. This book by Bartlett really shows where we are now and where can we go from it. So I would consider it a good book.
I would highly recommend The Truth Matters by Bruce Bartlett. I found it an easy read and very comprehensible. I like how the author does a timeline of evolution through media, radio, TV, broadcasting, the differences between party bias. I like how he provides resources such as databases, for example, in libraries, that we can have access to research information that is scholarly without paying a $200 to $400 membership. So it's very nice to know that those resources are right in front of us and he's just addressing them.
Yeah, it's a good, short, quick book. So I recommend, because you're trying to help people that are not trying to say, the heck with everything, all I want is my own point of view, and that's the end of it. You're trying to helpfully have people that say, hey, I need some grasp of how I go out and try to learn on my own. And he provides that, and that's a good thing. I did like the area in the book where he felt that sometimes there's too much of this twoism, which he called it, that you're trying to present 2 points of view equally. And he says sometimes, no, you got to emphasize that this one side is definitely stronger than the other side, and that wasn't done. So, good book. We recommend it. Thank you.